Hi, everybody. I am spiritual medium and psychotherapist Kellee White. I'm here with my very good friend.
I'm Dr. Shirley Impellizzeri. Happy to be here and to be with you, Kel, and with everybody, even though I can't see anybody, which is better on my nervous system.
You know what? You're probably right. I like that, Shirley. And really, welcome back, everybody, to Psychology and the Soul, where psychology and spirituality come together in real, grounded conversation. And today's topic is one that everybody is talking about right now, and that is narcissism. Now, it's a word that gets used a lot. I mean, I remember my mom talking about this. Actually, Shirley, like in the late 60s and the very early 70s. I don't know. She was describing my dad. What can I say?
Yeah, it's been around since the first person landed on Earth.
So true. It's so true. And it is a word that gets used a lot. And sometimes it is accurate. Sometimes it's said loosely. Mm-hmm. And often without a full understanding of what's actually happening beneath the surface. And so today we're not here to label and we're not here to diagnose, although we could. We're not. We're definitely not here to oversimplify it either. But we're going to slow this topic down, and we're going to look at patterns, and we're going to look at behaviors, and we're going to look at impact, and more importantly, how to stay connected to yourself when you're inside of this situation, because that's where people get lost. And Shirley, you found this great quote, and I just love this quote today. I'm not sure who said it, but if you guys like this one, it's such a good one. It's one reason why narcissists and sociopaths are so successful is because healthy people can't wrap their minds around the fact that people like this actually exist.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important. And before we get deep into the topic of narcissism, I want to just mention briefly from a spiritual perspective that when we choose certain experiences in life, we're going to have different people in our life and different experiences in our life. It's always to help us know thyself. And what around personality disorders, when we're just today going to be talking about narcissists, but there are so many varying examples of this. But when we start down that path, I always remember that they are incredible teachers because they force us to set boundaries. They force us to take care of ourselves in a way that maybe if we hadn't had that experience, we wouldn't. So what's really important is in a few weeks, I'm going to do a show on life reviews, but it's not just a typical show on life review. It's going to be a show with what is it that we've done while we're here on earth that we could have done differently? Like, really, what is it? And often I will have souls on the other side say to me things about, I wish I had left sooner. I should not have. I wish I had done certain things with certain people earlier or later. Do you know? I should have left earlier. Wish I'd stood up for myself.
You mean left the relationship earlier, not left Earth earlier, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So, it has a lot to do with people that are very difficult. Yeah. So Shirley, go ahead and let's start talking about narcissism.
Well, because it goes against how we have, called social idioms, social norms, where it's how we expect people to behave. And that just showed up because we lived in tribes. And in order to stay in the tribe, so you don't get kicked out, and then you're alone in the jungle and you get killed by the tiger who's behind you, that you're there by yourself. You can't see behind you. So we live in a tribe. So you can see behind me and you can go, hey, sure, there's a tiger approaching. And that would save my life. So we expect people to act in certain ways. And so when someone acts in a completely different way, it's hard to believe that that's real, and because it comes in behavior, we think people can change their behavior. But, narcissism has become a widely used term, often used to describe difficult, self-centered, and harmful behavior. But clinically, it's a lot more complex than that. We're looking at patterns that include a strong focus on the self, difficulty with empathy, not because they don't care. It's almost like missing the computer chip of empathy. It's really, the brain is wired differently. a need for validation or control. Inside, they feel completely out of control, so they have to absolutely control their environment. And often underlying insecurity that isn't always visible on the surface. Yeah, narcissists are one of the most insecure people. So the ones that have to tell you all the time, the grandiose ones about how great they are, it's because really inside they feel this small. Yeah. Now, that isn't to excuse the behavior. That's to understand it and know you need to walk away. But we'll get into that later. Most importantly, to say this clearly, not everyone who displays narcissistic traits has narcissistic personality disorder. It's on a spectrum. So somebody might have some traits, and if there's insight, then that is wonderful, because you can help somebody who has insight. Like, wow, why I'm not feeling like I care that I missed your birthday. Mm-hmm. A little bit of insight, I miss your birthday. So what? My life is so busy. That's different, because there's no ability for insight.
Mm-hmm. Actually, accountability.
There's just defending.
Responsibility. It's just defending. Yeah.
Because if I were to say, I am so sorry I missed your birthday, I'm admitting fault. And their sense of self, which we call ego, their sense of self is so incredibly fragile that if I admit to something, I completely disintegrate. So that's at the core of it. But today we're going to separate the term from the trend, and really talk about the lived experience, both internally and relationally.
Right, right. And there is a difference between somebody having a narcissistic trait and then somebody having a personality disorder. And I think the distinction really matters, because without it, everything becomes labeled and nothing is understood.
Right. Exactly. When we overuse the term, we lose its nuance. Mm-hmm. And what we want to look at are patterns, things like entitlement, lack of accountability, projection, emotional manipulation, difficulty tolerating criticism. And these, when they become a pattern, that's when the recipient needs to start to view things differently. Everybody can show entitlement at times, or can be mean at times. But if I'm able to own and apologize and repair, that's very different. If this is now a pattern, then that's what to look at. We also want to understand that these patterns don't exist in isolation. They're part of a larger psychological structure. Wow. That's what we call their narcissistic, what they need in order to supply. It's called the narcissistic supply.
Right. And when we only focus on labeling somebody, we actually miss what's happening in the dynamic. Okay. So because the impact is not just about the person, but it's about the relationship. Shirley, what have you seen in terms of how people misunderstand narcissism the most?
Yeah. Well, again, without diagnosing or labeling, what helps with labeling is to understand. So it's not about labeling someone and then it's to understand that there's a issue. Mm-hmm. So sometimes we think people's just being a little selfish, but it's not that. The disorder of narcissism is more complex and nuanced and dangerous, because most narcissistic people don't think I'm toxic. They think I'm misunderstood. Mm-hmm. They rewrite stories in their mind where they're always the victim or the hero, never the problem. That's the pattern that you need to start watching out for. There's no guilt, because in their version, there's no wrongdoing. Mm-hmm. The facts are reorganized in real time to protect the self-image that can't tolerate any damage. Right. So it's important to know these things and to understand them. This is not a personality trait. It's a distorted relationship with reality.
Right. As soon as you said, you were talking about that they can be dangerous. First thing I thought about is somebody who believes that they are the greatest driver in the world, and they will go crazy putting you in the car, going fast and in and out of traffic, as if that, and that's their reality, that it's safe to drive with them because they are good drivers.
Exactly. When the facts speak very differently. But once they believe something, they will defend it.
Yes.
So in psychology, we call it the self-serving bias. We protect our self-image, even if it means distorting reality. When we confront someone who has these narcissistic traits, they don't reflect, they deflect. They blame, they gaslight, and they minimize. They truly believe their own narrative. And so confidence isn't self-awareness, and that's a distinction that's very, very important. So they're defending what they've convinced themselves of.
Oh, very much.
Yeah.
I remember somebody that believed that he was the greatest pilot in the world. He was such a great pilot, and he got in an accident, overshot the runway. I'll never forget this as long as I live. And he is immediately literally blamed everybody else, had nothing to do with him. And he was still the greatest pilot ever, and went into making other pilot accidents over and over. It was the damnedest thing ever.
Wow. Yeah, exactly. So what they believe is what they believe. And so the recipient of it, and there's no arguing with them or trying to,
there's no awareness.
Because there's no awareness. So the recipient just needs to get that information, file it in your mind. Okay, this is what I'm dealing with. And then make decisions.
But Shirley, do you think it's not usually that, like it might happen once and then the next time it happens, and then you start filing it away and you're watching the pattern at that point?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not that easy. I mean, once you realize the pattern, you're already bonded now, because usually, people don't act like this initially. And when they don't act like this initially, we think, oh, they can hold it together. But there's a survival mechanism there that takes place unconsciously, because we're hardwired to bond with people. That's how the species, continued. And so this behavior is not going to come out at the beginning. It starts to come out little by little. Mm-hmm. And once we're bonded, it's not an easy thing. So please don't blame yourself if you're in a relationship with someone who has these features, or you got out of one after so many years, because the bond that we make with people is very strong, and it's not that easy, especially because at times they will act, they will, the person that we fell in love with shows up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, every conflict, every relationship, every version of events is reconstructed to position them as reasonable, wronged, or exceptional, which is what you're talking about. They can look at someone they have genuinely harmed and feel nothing but bafflement at their reaction, because they've already convinced themselves that the story went, they rewrite history in a way, right? Their internal version of events has already erased what happened. Their sincerity is real. I mean, because it really is. The erasure is real.
Yeah.
But, both of those things are true at once. The level of self-deception is not normal. It's pathological. That's where you cross the border to a personality disorder. It's when the deception is pathological, when they've actually rewritten the story in their mind, believe that, and will argue to the death about something that is not right. So anytime you kind of question yourself, wait a minute, do I remember that correctly? Is it me? You might be dealing with someone with these characteristics.
Right. It's very true. And the experience of being in this relationship, let's talk about the experience of being in a relationship with somebody who has these patterns, because this is where people start to feel like they're losing themselves.
Yeah.
Because there's confusion. There's self-doubt. You start self-doubt, doubting yourself.
Right.
There's a term called walking on eggshells. So if I'm in a session with somebody and they're telling me the story, one of the first things I will say is, are you walking on eggshells? Yes, that's exactly what it is. And at that point, we're dealing with, a deeper personality disorder at this point, but walking on eggshells is a big one. Constantly trying to get it right. Like, like if I do this, then I'll get it right. If I do this, I'll get it right. You won't. And it's emotionally exhausting to be with this.
Yeah. And this is where, where we're trying to get them to see, reality or be reasonable. That's where we often see gaslighting happen. It's important to really understand what that means, because the term gets used a lot. Again, it's diluted because we use it so often, but it's not always we don't use it always accurately. Gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation where someone causes another person to question their own reality. Mm-hmm. And that, in a nutshell, is what gaslighting is. So you question your thoughts, you question your memories, your feelings, even your own intuition.
Mm-hmm.
And the way people gaslight, it can sound like that didn't happen. You're overreacting. You're too sensitive. You always twist things. Mm-hmm. And over time, this creates confusion to the recipient of it, because again, at times they act loving. At times they act like the person you fell in love with. And so that, we call that intermittent reinforcement, is so hard to fathom, that we start to question ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
What's important to understand is that gaslighting doesn't always look extreme or obvious. Sometimes it can be very, very subtle. It's not always loud and aggressive. It can be quiet, dismissive, even presented as a concern. Are you sure you want to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Which plants the seed of confusion.
Mm-hmm. And doubt, self-doubt.
Exactly. It's the gradual shifting of reality, where what you experience gets minimized, denied, or reframed so often that you begin to question yourself. That's when you start to ask yourself, did I misunderstand that? Or am I making a bigger deal of this than it is? Maybe it's me. Maybe I did something to cause this. All those questions can kind of clue you in that you might be dealing with someone who's on the continuum of narcissism. And that's where the real impact happens, because that causes, as you just said, some self-doubt, kind of planting the seeds of self-doubt. Because over time, a person stops trusting their own thoughts, feelings, and perceptions, and starts relying more on the other person to define what's real. And so now I'm relying on you for my own reality.
Mm-hmm.
You start to imagine your own internal trust. And you stop listening to your intuition. You kind of shut it down.
It's very destabilizing.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why spiritually we always say, know thyself. And even if you know thyself so well, this can still happen. This can still happen.
Yeah.
They get in the oddest ways, but it can happen. And it is very destabilizing when this happens. Just for a second, Shirley, I mean, talking about just with gaslighting, I think it's really important to understand something here, because an example might be, you promised you'd help me with that presentation last night. And the gaslighter might say, I never said that. You must be imagining things. Why would I promise something like that when you know how busy I am?
Right. So there's the blame.
There's the blame. Another one might, to minimize feelings, you might say, I feel really hurt when you make jokes about my family. And I've heard this one from so many of my clients. It hurts me when you make jokes about my family. And the gaslighter or the narcissist will say, oh, come on, you're too sensitive. Now, for all my empaths out there, you're too sensitive? Seriously? Yeah. And here, as an empath, you're trying to set your boundaries and know thyself and feel good about yourself. So it's awful when that happens. And then when they'll say something like, Cheryl, it was just a joke. You need to lighten up. Can't you take a joke? Oh my God, that drives me insane.
Exactly. That's just it. That minimizes it, and again, puts it on the person, okay, he was just joking, or she was just joking, or they were just joking. Right. And it really minimizes the person's feelings. How different would it be if somebody responded, oh, I'm so sorry that hurt your feelings.
Right.
And then once that lands, then share the intention. I really was just joking, but I'm really sorry. So now you're holding both coexist. I can validate how you feel, and I can also share with you what my intention was.
Right.
It was not to hurt you deliberately. Right.
Right.
But it's the inability to validate how the person feels. That's the clue.
Right.
If there's always a defense and a turnaround and blame you, now I'm the victim of your oppressive, too sensitivity, that starts to clue you in.
Oh my God, that is so true. And that part is so disorienting. It's so disorienting because, again, it doesn't happen all at once. Mm-hmm. It actually happens slowly over time. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly you no longer trust yourself. Mm-hmm. And so, Shirley, what are some of the early signs that people might miss when they're entering these dynamics? And as far as stalking and stalkers and everything like that goes, Shirley and I are going to be teaching a class at the end of June. I think it's June 27th. And we will be talking, going to deeper of this. We're just kind of touching as much as we can on narcissism tonight.
Yeah. So this is just kind of a little bit just to kind of, because sometimes you feel like what's wrong with me, or I'm going crazy, unless somebody spells it out and it's kind of formulaic. I was working with this person who, unfortunately, mother was a narcissist, and the kid was a teenager, and I started to understand, what dynamic we were talking about. And I go, does she do this and this? And he goes, yeah. And I go, and then when you do this, does she do that and that? He goes, yeah. By the third time, he goes, do you know my mom?
Okay, that's so funny.
But again, not to label, but it is kind of formulaic. They have certain characteristics that they all kind of fall into in different degrees.
Right.
So it's important to have this information so you can start to see it.
Mm-hmm. To see the patterns of it.
Start to see the patterns. I'd written something on narcissism, borderline personality disorder, and I gave it to this editor to read. And like a year later, she sent me an email and said, if I had never heard of personality disorders. And if I hadn't read that, she goes, I met this person. It was amazing from the get-go. We had the most magical weekend. And then I started to notice. And I ended it that weekend. And I saved myself a world of misery only because she knew what to look for, right, because of characteristics. And that's not an easy thing to do, because the flip side is extremely charming.
Mm-hmm.
I almost view that kind of, it's how they get people in, so they can then get their, again, what we call narcissistic supply. So they can get what they need in order to, not feel a shell of themselves, because otherwise, without somebody mirroring that, it's almost like they don't exist. Yeah. Right.
If you have self-worth issues, and then all of a sudden somebody starts love bombing you, it's intoxicating.
Exactly. So when you asked about some signs, love bombing can be very distracting and alluring in the beginning. And it's like, look at it as, when something feels too much, a little bit too soon, too much, even though it can feel amazing, especially people like myself that come from neglect, when you've had no attention paid on you from emotional neglect, and all of a sudden someone is just thinking that, you walk on water, that can feel so intoxicating and so alluring. And so then we start to make excuses and we try to rationalize. And, it's really something to run by somebody if you're not sure, run it by a friend, or if you have a therapist, run it by a therapist. So to kind of save yourself from bonding, so you don't bond. If it's a relationship, if it's a parent or a sibling, that's a different, that's setting boundaries. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But, the way they tell stories can be a tell. If they're always the victim of their story, wrongdoing was always done to them. And there's no owning.
And Shirley, what happens with that is, as an empath, you're hearing their story, and the poor person, oh my goodness. And the empath I'm telling you, the bonding has already begun.
Yeah. Because they have such a difficult time owning any wrongdoing, even if it's just, so look for that there's always a person who doesn't talk in a balanced way. Well, I said something that was kind of hurtful, and so then they responded that way. That's owning something. But no, that person was mean to me because, and they're always the victim of their story. Then that's a clue in. That's something to look out for.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the biggest patterns that we see is projection. So that is where what belongs to one person gets placed onto another person.
Yeah. So when they, over time, that creates a distortion, because someone is consistently being told, you're the problem, you're too sensitive, you're overreacting. And eventually the person starts to believe it, and it's many times what they're projecting is how they were treated or how they feel, or that part of them that was fragmented, that shadow side that couldn't exist because they were, these people come from a lot of abuse.
Yeah.
And so they project onto you kind of how they felt.
And I always tell, again, my empaths out there, that you can give these people all of your blood, hook them up, and it will not be enough.
Yeah.
It's never enough.
Yeah.
So as they started, and then they start adjusting themselves, and it's not based on truth, but it's based on what's being projected onto them.
Right. 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 Projection protects the person who is unable to take accountability, but it stabilizes the person that's receiving it. You know, how can you be so insensitive? Well, truly, I'm the one that's insensitive because I don't have that empathy chip in my brain, but I'm blaming it on you and telling you that you're insensitive. So that's an example of projection. It's something that I don't have.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that's about me that I'm projecting onto you. You know, they have this, this saying, I can't remember who the psychologist is that came up with it. It's called DARVO, and it's an acronym.
Mm-hmm.
And it's D is deny, A is accuse, and V is victim. Let me see, Darbo, DAV, deny, accuse, reverse, victim, and oppressor. So I come to you and say, you know what you did really hurt my feelings. And then they reverse that. They become the victim of what you just said. How can you say that? Don't you know that I was doing this for you? And what about everything you've done? You know, and so all of a sudden it gets switched. And the person that came with a concern is now the perpetrator of all the bad stuff.
God.
Yeah.
Oh my God. How do people begin to recognize what is actually theirs and what isn't in a relationship with a narcissist?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think that you might be in a relationship with a narcissist, I would start to keep a journal, because memory is not good. You know, we can remember certain things if they hit us a certain way, right? But in general, memory is not, we can't trust memory. So you start to keep a journal to remember exactly how things happened. You know, don't distort what you know to be real. Check it out with someone, check it out with a friend. You know, this just happened. How does this sound to you? Or with a therapist? You know, you really need to trust your feelings and intuition, because the intuition will be the first to tell you something doesn't feel right.
Right.
You know, so those are important. Those are important things. And look for patterns. I mean, you're going to have to go, like your mom would teach me, go into your left brain. You can't come at it from the right brain, the emotional brain and stuff, because if this is someone that you love, if it's a parent, if it's a sibling, if it's a partner, you love them. So there's a bond there. So you really have to switch into the logical part of your brain and look at facts, look at the patterns.
So Shirley, just because, can we talk a couple of minutes about covert narcissists so people will understand what that is?
Yeah. Yeah. It is
the sneakiest of them all.
Right. Exactly. Grandiose narcissist. We all know one.
Yeah.
I'm the best person ever. And and they announce it and they don't give a shit, because they just know they're great.
Yeah.
And everybody should know. And the ones that don't, I don't want to waste my time with. Right. The covert are the ones that don't have that. They actually might have kind of low self-esteem because they're always the victim. Oh, can you believe this happened to me? Can you believe that person did that? Can you believe, so we call them the vulnerable narcissists. And the problem is that in order to feel good about themselves, they have to pick at you and your confidence and your self-esteem. Yeah. So they might present as this wonderful person.
They're the best people. Look what they do. They help so much. They do this. They help everybody.
Right, exactly. They'll go to the nth degree. A friend needs them. They will drive through 3 hours to go to that friend, who needs them and stuff. So friends and everybody else never sees that behavior because it only comes out with the person, with the with their attachment figure. Yeah, yeah. And also in families, if it's a parent, only the family unit gets to see that part of them.
Right.
To the friends, they're the best thing ever. Coworkers, they're the best thing ever because they're always willing to help. They're always willing to do. That way, when people, when people bring up something that hurts their feelings or when things don't work out, they can say, see, all I did was I was trying to help them and I did everything for them and look at how they treat me.
Right. I did everything for you.
Right.
I mean, they are, and they just can sneak in because you really don't see it coming with one of them, with a person
You
like
really don't, because it's really tricky because they present so differently.
that.
I mean, that's a character that we can kind of, compare them to. They just present as so friendly and so nice and so giving, and yeah.
Yeah, that's how they present. And next thing you know, you're involved with somebody like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Because
tough.
they tried, the first clue will be when you bring up something that you're not happy with, or when you bring up an issue.
Ah, okay.
How they respond to that will tell you everything.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a drag, Shirley. These narcissists, golly.
Yeah, I call them like, they're like pod people. You remember that movie? What was it called? They remade it. Oh God, it was the aliens, and it was a pod under your bed.
Yes.
Fell asleep. Oh
Yeah.
God, what was that movie called? I can't remember.
I remember the one you're talking about. I can't remember the name of it. So Shirley, tell me, so this is where boundaries are not just helpful, but they are necessary. And again, spiritually speaking, we come to Earth. We're going to have all kinds of difficult classes on Earth. Personality disorders, I think, is definitely on the agenda for this time on Earth at this particular time. And I think that setting boundaries is the most important thing that somebody can do in their life.
Right, exactly. And boundaries are often misunderstood because they're not about controlling someone else's behavior. And the narcissist in your life may call you controlling if you set a boundary. Why are you trying to control me?
For sure.
But they're about defining what you will and won't engage in, what you will and not tolerate, what you need to remain in. Because what happens is you need to remain emotionally and psychologically intact, for your own good.
Yeah, you really.
If someone wants to drag you into something, how could you be so insensitive? How could you? Okay.
Yeah.
You can't engage. You can't try and defend. You can't. The mistake that we make a lot, and it's hard not to, is we get into this thing of trying to defend. We're hoping against hope that they're going to see it from our perspective. And they cannot.
No,
they cannot see. They can only see the world through their own perspective. So trying to defend yourself, trying to get them to reason, to understand, even to understand your own point of view, is going to land on deaf ears. And so the boundary there would be, okay, this is how you see it. Okay. I'm not going to engage in that.
Right. Shirley, it's so funny. In the body snatchers, it's sort of the invasion of
body snatchers. Yes, that's it.
Oh my God! I think when people hear the word boundaries, they immediately think of to confront somebody, but really, boundaries start internally. So, an example might be, not. How about this one? Not over explaining yourself.
Exactly.
So many people do. You're involved with this person, and you keep thinking that you'll be able to say it over and over. And if you say it this way, they can hear it. No, do not. So a great boundary with that one is not over explaining yourself.
Exactly.
And then not engaging in circular or unproductive arguments, because we all know those, and they will be circular, And then recognizing when a conversation is no longer grounded in reality. And that's, again, know thyself, use your intuition, stepping back emotionally instead of trying to fix or prove.
Right. On that one is because they're sharing how they've rewritten the story, and you're trying to get them to, but no, remember when this happened and then that happened. When you find yourself doing that, it's best to just go, okay, I see that that's how you remember it. Okay. I remember it differently.
It's kind of like gray rocking. Yeah. Okay. And allow silence instead of trying to fill the space. And I know a lot of people get really anxious with that one. I'm watching this show. It's Beef season 2, and it's a hard one to watch. I'm kind of fascinated, but it's a hard one to watch. And I noticed the couples, it's a constant, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. And it's like trying to hold the relationships together. It's interesting, Shirley, with that, instead of just, keeping silent, for yourself here.
Yeah. Well, because we have this kind of need or this tendency to, again, over-explain, to try and get them to see it from our point of view, just to even consider our point of view. You know, I mean, how wonderful for an argument to go, okay, you see it that way, I saw it this way, and two differing point of views can coexist.
Yeah, they can't with a narcissist.
They
Usually
can't.
they have to win at all costs.
You have to see it through their eyes. Otherwise, there's something wrong with you. You're doing this to me. How can you do that? You're oversensitive. You know, it's then the blame goes on you. So boundaries are clarity. They're not punishment and they're not rejection. And they will say that they are. Why are you punishing me? Why are you rejecting me? What they really are is a form of self-respect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What shifts for someone when they begin holding boundaries consistently, Shirley? What shifts for somebody? I'm in the boundary stage of my life and I'm loving it.
Yeah, well, it's you gain self-respect. You're doing something kind for yourself. It's going to get twisted and like you're doing something wrong. So when you said they're our biggest teachers, it can teach us to take care of ourselves. Maybe we come from families where we weren't taken care of, where our needs weren't, weren't nurtured. And so we don't know how to do that. So setting boundaries is a way to start to take care of ourselves.
Yeah. And in that life review that we do, ultimately, it's, were you good to yourself? That will be a big question. Were you good to yourself?
And so often we don't include ourselves in the equation. We're wonderful to friends. We're wonderful to, family members, but we don't include ourselves in that equation. So why can't we be wonderful to ourselves?
Right.
Not exclusively, but in addition to, setting a boundary can be as subtle as I'm not answering the phone.
Mm-hmm.
If you know that it's someone who's going to call you to want to argue, to want to blame you, to all that, I'm not answering the phone.
Yeah.
That's a boundary.
It's an empath's hardest thing to learn and the most important thing that they have to learn.
Yeah.
The most important.
Because I think empaths are so, you can feel the other person's hurt and pain.
And their rage. You can feel their rage if you don't do it. I mean, we didn't even get into the rage aspect of this, but narcissists tend to rage.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because they have to defend their really fragile sense of self. And that's why the more you try to reason with them, the more you're going to defend it. And that's why there's no point. That's why it's best to just, walk away or just answer in a very, okay.
Right.
It's funny. I compare it to, they don't have that character on anymore. Well, that guy isn't on the show anymore, but Saturday Night Live. Do you remember the character Chad?
I don't know if I do.
My God. Okay. If whoever's listening out there doesn't remember it, look it up. It's hilarious. It was Pete Davidson, I think it was. And he just didn't get bothered by anything. A fire could be in front of him. Okay. That was his answer to everything. Okay. So we need to become like Chad when you're dealing with a narcissist.
That's very funny.
And you did this, and then you did that. Okay. Become Chad.
Become Chad. Oh my God. Yeah. And I think that, again, one of the most common patterns that we see is if I just explain myself, they'll understand. They won't.
Exactly. Because if someone lacks empathy or accountability, more explanation is not going to create change. Right. It's going to create more opportunity for distortion. It's going to create more opportunity for fight, for blame. Mm-hmm. Kindness only works with those who have the capacity to respect it.
So we got to repeat that, Shirley, because I think people need to understand that, because yes, we want to be kind in the world. However, kindness only works on those who have the capacity to respect it.
Right. And that doesn't mean that then with people who are narcissistic, we're unkind. We're neutral. We become Chad. So that's not unkind, although they might blame you for being unkind because you're not going into the dance anymore with them.
Because they'll project on that.
Exactly. But knowing that neutrality is not unkind, although they might accuse you of being unkind. Mm-hmm. Well, nothing disarms a narcissist faster than realizing that they no longer have control of you.
So true. Yeah. So true. Yeah. That's setting that boundary.
Absolutely. Because every time you excuse their behavior, you're sending them the message that they can treat you like that. Mm-hmm. A narcissist doesn't seek balance in a relationship. They seek dominance, even if it's very subtle.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's very subtle.
They have to be on top. They have to win at all costs.
Exactly, exactly. And you can't negotiate, with a narcissist through kindness because they don't understand. It's almost like you're speaking a different language to them. They don't understand.
Well, they see it as a weakness.
Right.
So there's no negotiating that.
Right. However, and that's where they put you in a double bind, because if you fight back, they don't respect that either.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll fight you until you're exhausted, until they've taken all your energy and you just kind of collapse and they've gained the control again.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a no-win situation. That's why they also call them energy vampires.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Reasoning with a narcissist never works. You bring facts, they bring denial. You bring emotions, they bring deflection.
Mm-hmm.
You try to resolve conflict and they bring the conflict right back on you and blame you for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So detachment is your most powerful weapon.
Right.
And that's what we're talking about. Become Chad. Detachment is your most. I think people who are going to Google, Chad Saturday Night Live are going to die laughing because he is just so okay, and it totally detached. I mean, that's how you would describe his character.
Well, that's funny.
When they blame you for something or try to engage you in an explanation, don't. Just say, "I'm sorry you see it that way."
Yeah, and that's up there with gray rocking. It's almost okay, all right.
And leave it alone. Okay.
Because your emotional reactions are their fuel. I mean, they don't see your anger. They don't see you're frustrated. They don't care about your sadness. They just see that as proof of control. They don't care about any of that.
Exactly. And so you're the one that's left, drained and not understanding. And, and you, people who haven't dealt with this a lot, you're left with thinking, but wait a minute. This did happen, and you're left confused and questioning yourself, and you run it in your mind over and over and over again because it doesn't make any sense.
All right. And then, what I've seen too, and I know you've seen this many times, is you hear a story and then those people, whoever the story is about, they're telling another story. And then the story is, everybody's hearing a version of the story. And it's always just an awful lot. And it's exhausting, And I think, Shirley, that, this show is about awareness. And so the real question becomes what's happening inside of you in these dynamics. Right. So the question for healing is, why did I let this continue for as long as I did? Which is a really good question, except that you have to have a lot of compassion for, you might have had a mother that was a narcissist or a borderline, or a father that was. Drugs and alcohol can play a part in this as well. I mean, there's all Shirley and I are trying to do is bring in awareness to your life, and awareness. And when you said earlier, Cheryl, like keeping a journal, writing these kind of things down that you remember or that you're witnessing, it will really help. Because, and as listen, Shirley and I both, I'll speak for you in this, we've both been with, personality disorders.
Oh yeah.
Funny. In fact, we're writing a book on it.
Yes. Because the other side of them, how they got through life, because if you just kind of act like a jerk, not a lot of people are going to be around you, right? So the other side is the charismatic piece, that just kind of draws you in. It feels like a drug almost. It draws you in, and once you're bonded.
Well, and that's the thing, again, something to look at. What part of you is willing to accept this behavior, okay? And when you ask that question, you might begin to see the deeper patterns that they play. Like maybe it was a belief instilled in childhood that love has got to be earned, or maybe it was a fear of abandonment that kept you clinging to a toxic relationship long past its expiration date. And maybe it was a subconscious narrative that you told your needs were secondary to somebody else's. That could be it too. Maybe it's identifying these patterns that true liberation begins. Okay. Once you start to recognize the mechanisms that made you susceptible to the narcissist's control, you can begin dismantling them, and you can begin establishing new boundaries, not just with them, but with yourself, which is really important. And you can begin redefining what you will and what you will not accept in your relationships. So ask yourself, what are you abandoning yourself? Where are you abandoning yourself?
Yeah. And these aren't, I just wanted to really clarify, this is, look at it with curiosity. When you're asking yourself, why did you let this go for as long as you did? I've asked myself that question too. So it's not about criticism or judgment or to feel bad about yourself. It's for compassion, to understand there's always a valid reason. So look at it with curiosity. That question can be asked so many different ways. Why did I let this continue for as long as I did? That's critical.
Yeah. Right.
Why did I let this continue for as long as I did? That's curiosity. Yeah. And there's a big difference.
Really, you guys, it's hard to get out of these relationships. It's not easy. Yeah. It's just not easy. Shirley, just briefly, are narcissists born this way, or is this a learned behavior?
They say that it's both nature and nurture, meaning that, there's a genetic predisposition for it. However, how you're treated at home, if you're coming from a very loving and nurturing and attuned environment, that gene stays dormant and doesn't get expressed. So you might be the person who maybe at times can show up a little bit selfish, but, oh, I'm so sorry. No, I didn't mean that, but you have that self-awareness because you were brought up in a very nurturing home, So while there is a predisposition, it doesn't mean that if you have a relative who's a narcissist, you're going to be a narcissist too. Even asking yourself that question lets you know that you're not, because they have no self-awareness. And so if you're asking yourself that, it's important to view that as you're being curious, So it is both. Okay. It is both.
It is both. Yeah. Seems I just see more of it now, Shirley, than I have ever. Just seems, I don't know why that is, but it just feels that way.
It depends on it. Feels that way because, if there's people out there in the media that act a certain way, then it's out there in the media and everybody sees it, so then it feels like there's more people than in your own world, Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Well, let's see. Well, and also, ask yourself what feels true versus what feels distorted. And this is a big one, but ask yourself, what would it look like to trust yourself again? And I remember, and I've repeated this many, many times, but I remember being in therapy, trying to get over a relationship with a narcissist. And I remember I said to the therapist, would I ever pick this again? And the therapist, unfortunately, said, no, you wouldn't do that. And that's just not the truth. The truth is you have to be very vigilant about who you have around you. And you have to really pay attention to the real red flags that are out there. Because it is possible. Just because you have one experience, you can have several. What do we call them, Shirley? Some people, the kryptonite, narcissists are their kryptonite.
Our narcissists are my kryptonite, right? Because we all came from what we came from. We can do our work and be more. I mean, I'll never forget this. A few years back, many years back, was it at least 5 years back? I was out with a friend, and these two gentlemen sat next to us, and there was one that I was particularly attracted to, and the other one not so much. And because I've got my old pal Kel, I sent her their birthdays and said, hey, what's the card for each one? And the one that I was attracted to was the sociopath card.
Yeah.
So, even with all the help, and I did not pursue that. Even with all the help, and all the your own therapy and stuff, we come from what we come from. However, that's why we're doing these podcasts. When you start to recognize the behavior, you can also say, okay, while I feel a pull towards this person, this is not good for me. Yeah. Or I need to get away from this. And that's where that's where the self-care comes in. That's where you set a boundary, even if from an emotional standpoint, you're still feeling that pull.
Yeah. And really pay attention to your body, because your body keeps the score with that. You can feel a little something's off.
Right. Exactly. And, again, the tell signs is how they speak. And also when you bring up something that you want to discuss, something that maybe hurt your feelings or something that is painful to you, how they respond to that.
Yeah.
Is a tell.
And it's so true, Shirley. Once you see a narcissist, and the whole thing, you can't unsee it.
Right.
You just can't believe it.
Right. Exactly. And again, know that other side, because there's that flip side, that charm, that, that unbelievable kind of, because they're also trained, because of their own childhood trauma, is to really get to know you really well and know where your soft spots are. So they're going to go for those soft spots like nobody's business.
Yeah.
And that's what draws you in. So that's
so true. Oh my God. And no, it's so true too, because no amount of anything that you can do with love or wisdom is going to change.
No,
unfortunately, it's just not.
Some point you just have to come to terms with that and set boundaries and know that it's easy. Setting boundaries doesn't mean that you're all of a sudden devoid of feelings and not, it's not easy. You will have feelings, but you also click into your left brain, like your mom used to teach me, and also know, is this good for me or not good for me?
Right. Or as I say, I move the empath aside. Step aside, empath. You're not doing me any good right now. I do that and it works every time.
Yeah. Yeah. So understanding these patterns allow people to move out of confusion and into clarity. And that's what we're hoping. And clarity is what supports healthier decisions, supports healthier boundaries and healthier relationships.
Truly. And clarity is what brings you back to yourself, and not the version of you that's shaped by somebody else's perception, but that version of you that knows what is true.
Yeah. And, it's important to work, especially if you have a parent who fits this description. It's important to work with a therapist, because it's also a grieving, and that's for a relationship too. It's grieving the parent that you needed so bad,
right,
in order to accept the parent that you actually have, and accepting that, grieving the relationship that you thought you were in, to accept that it wasn't that and why you needed to walk away.
Absolutely. Isn't Earth hard? It's such a hard school. It's so hard, Cheryl. I don't want to do it again. I'm done. I'm done. I don't want to do it again.
Yeah.
You guys want to go deeper into this work that Shirley and I are talking about with personality disorders, and understanding patterns and understanding triggers and understanding boundaries in a real grounded way? We invite you to join us for our upcoming class, which is called Understanding Personality Patterns, Triggers, and Boundaries. And in this experience, we're going to guide you through recognizing patterns without judgment, understanding emotional triggers. We're going to talk about the nervous system regulation and building boundaries that truly support your well-being. So you can learn more about this, and you can reserve your spot in our class. It's June 27th. It's on Zoom. It's at 9 a.m. to about 11:30 Pacific time. On June 27th. And I just want to say this, in the class, we will also be answering a lot of questions, and we're going to cover a lot, go really deep into this personality situation if you find yourself in a situation. So you'll have Shirley and me to tell your story, and we'll go right into it with you too.
Right. We'll have ample time for questions and answers, because I know that bringing up these topics brings up a lot of questions.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll have a lot of time to answer your questions, So thank you for being part of this conversation with us. They're not always easy topics, but they're important ones. The more we understand these patterns, the more we're able to make choices to support our well-being, because that is key. It's compassion for the self, to support our relationships, to support our sense of self too. Yeah. We hope that this gave you not just insight, but clarity. Yeah. And we will see you next week on Psychology and the Soul. What are we going to talk about next week?
Talk about AI. Believe it or not, Cheryl, how it's impacting us psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually.
Yeah.
There's always going to be big topics to talk about, Cheryl.
Always going to be. I mean, AI can be a wonderful thing, but also it can be not so great.
Yeah. We'll be talking about that next week.
Teach you what to look for.
Yeah. So thanks, everybody. Thank you, Shirley. I'll see you next week.
Kel. Love you. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.